My father kicked my chair out from under me at my sister's wedding reception. "Guests of worth, sit here, not you," he declared as my shoulder hit the marble floor. My mother followed up by pouring a full glass of red wine over my head, while the bride laughed. They thought they were humiliating a worthless freeloader. They had no idea my phone had just vibrated in my pocket with a notification confirming I had purchased the debt on their entire estate. I did not scream. I just stood up knowing the ceremony could not proceed without the venue's new legal owner. The steel toe of Richard's dress shoe slammed into the leg of my chair with enough force to splinter the wood. Gravity vanished. My shoulders struck the marble floor of the Greenwich Estate ballroom with a sickening crack. A crystal water goblet tipped over the table edge, shattering inches from my face. The jazz band playing in the corner abruptly stopped. Over 200 wealthy guests fell dead silent. I looked up. Richard Pierce, the man whose last name I share, stood over me. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke tuxedo. "Guests of worth sit at this table." Richard sneered, his voice carrying effortlessly across the cavernous room. "Worthless parasites belong in the alley." A few venture capitalists at the adjacent tables let out low, mocking chuckles. At the head table, my older sister Vanessa adjusted the bodice of her custom Vera Wang wedding gown. She leaned over to her bridesmaids and giggled, pointing a manicured finger at my sprawling form. I pushed my palms against the cold marble, preparing to stand, but a shadow fell over me. Evelyn, my mother, stepped out from behind Richard. She snatched a brimming glass of Cabernet from the center console. She did not throw it. She tilted her wrist and poured the dark red liquid directly over my head. The wine soaked my hair, running down my forehead and seeping deep into the collar of my cheap black suit. The icy liquid stung my eyes. "You ruin everything you touch," Evelyn hissed through gritted teeth. "You are a stain on your sister's perfect day. Clean up this mess and get out of our sight." 4 years ago, Evelyn stole my Social Security number to purchase illegal prescription painkillers, then filed a police report claiming I was a drug addict to cover her tracks. That single fabricated report destroyed my Wall Street financial internship. They threw me onto the street with nothing, branding me a delusional failure to their country club friends. I did not wipe the wine from my face. I stood up slowly, ignoring the stinging pain radiating down my arm. I smoothed out the lapels of my ruined jacket. In my right pocket, my phone vibrated twice. I knew exactly what that notification meant. The wire transfer had cleared. "My name is Audrey. I am 32 years old, and I work as a distressed debt buyer. I acquire toxic liabilities and liquidate bankrupt empires." Richard and Evelyn paraded around this luxury venue, acting like royalty, blissfully oblivious that their event planning company had been secretly bleeding cash for a year. They did not know I had just spent the last 3 weeks quietly purchasing every single defaulted promissory note attached to the Pierce family's name. Before I show you how I turned my sister's wedding into a public foreclosure, tell me where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button if you believe toxic parents always reap what they sow. The wine dripped from my chin, staining my collar a dark, bruised purple. I straightened my spine, refusing to wipe the liquid from my eyes. The silence in the ballroom was heavy, thick with the unvoiced judgment of 200 elite guests waiting to see how the outcast would react. Vanessa stepped out from behind the head table, the satin train of her designer gown whispering across the polished floor. She snatched a linen cloth napkin from a nearby tray. It was stained with grease and littered with crumbs from a passing appetizer cart. Without a second of hesitation, she hurled the dirty fabric directly at my face. It hit my cheek with a wet slap before dropping to the marble floor. "Wipe the floor and get out to the parking lot," Vanessa ordered, her voice ringing sharp and clear through the silent room. "Dad hired you as a $15 an hour valet, not to sneak into the VIP table and embarrass the family." I looked down at the soiled napkin near my shoes. I kept my hands at my sides. I did not bend down to pick it up. Richard lost whatever thin veneer of patience he had left. He lunged across the short distance separating us. His large hand clamped onto the collar of my cheap suit jacket. The thin fabric tore under his grip. He yanked me forward with a harsh, unyielding force, using his entire body weight to throw me off balance. My worn dress shoes lost their grip on the wine-slicked marble. I fell hard. My hands shot out instinctively to brace the impact, landing squarely on the shattered remains of the crystal water goblet he had broken moments earlier. Jagged shards of thick glass bit deep into the flesh of my palms. The pain was instantaneous and blinding, a hot flare shooting up my arms. Warm blood welled up immediately from the deep cuts pooling in the creases of my hands and mixing with the sticky red wine already coating the floor. A thick crimson stream trailed down my left forearm, tracing a familiar uneven path. The blood found the raised tissue of a long scar running vertically down my wrist. The sensation of sharp glass tearing into my skin pulled the air straight from my lungs. The grand ballroom, the jazz band, the whispering guests all faded into a dull, distant roar. The metallic scent of fresh blood hit the back of my throat, transporting me away from the Greenwich estate and straight back to the suffocating confines of my father's home office 7 years ago. I was 25 years old. My grandfather had just passed away, leaving a $200,000 trust fund solely in my name. It was my only lifeline. That money represented the tuition for my final years of graduate school, a down payment on a modest apartment, and an escape velocity from the Pierce family's relentless financial control. Richard had summoned me to his study on a Tuesday evening. The air inside the room was heavy with the smell of expensive scotch and hidden desperation. His event planning company was drowning in debt. Creditors were circling his accounts, threatening to seize his assets. He needed liquid cash to cover a massive shortfall, and my grandfather's trust was the only untapped resource left in his proximity. A legal relinquishment form sat perfectly centered on his leather desk blotter. He shoved a heavy gold fountain pen into my hand. "Sign the paper," he demanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. I looked down at the document that would sign away my entire future. I shook my head, my fingers trembling around the cold metal of the pen. I told him I needed that money to finish my degree. I pleaded with him, explaining that this trust was my only chance to build a secure, independent life. Richard did not see a daughter begging for her future. He saw a subordinate defying a direct order. "You owe this family everything you have," he growled, stepping around the massive mahogany desk. I took a step back toward the heavy oak door. I dropped the pen onto the rug. I refused to sign. The rejection triggered a sudden rage he made no effort to contain. Richard crossed the distance between us in 2 rapid strides. He raised his arm and shoved me hard against the chest with both hands. My heels caught on the thick edge of the Persian rug. I lost my balance entirely, stumbling backward with no way to catch myself. I crashed directly into the antique glass display cabinet that housed his prized collection of vintage crystal decanters. The wooden frame groaned, and the thick glass door shattered on impact. I fell through the heavy panes. Large, jagged shards rained down around me like falling ice. One heavy wedge-shaped piece of glass sliced clean across my left wrist as I instinctively raised my arms to shield my face. The sound of tearing flesh was loud in the quiet study. Blood sprayed across the polished hardwood floor, bright and alarming. I collapsed among the ruined crystal, clutching my injured arm. The cut was dangerously deep, missing the main artery by a fraction of an inch, but bleeding profusely. I gasped for air, waiting for my father to react, waiting for him to grab a towel to call for an ambulance to show a single ounce of paternal remorse. He just stood there looking down at me with cold indifference, brushing a tiny shard of glass off the crease of his tailored trousers. The study door swung open. Evelyn stepped into the room. She wore a pristine white tennis outfit, holding a half-empty glass of iced tea in her manicured hand. She looked at the shattered cabinet. She looked at the blood pooling rapidly around my knees. She looked at Richard. She did not rush to my side. She did not drop her glass to apply pressure to my bleeding wrist. Evelyn stepped carefully over the bloodstains on the rug, walked into the hallway, and grabbed my packed duffel bag from the coat closet. She dragged it to the front door and tossed it carelessly onto the concrete driveway. She walked back to the doorway of the study, looking down at me with eyes devoid of any human warmth. "A delusional psycho," Evelyn said, her voice steady and ice-cold. "Hurting yourself just to frame your father. You are a danger to this family." I pressed my good hand against the gaping wound on my wrist, staring at my own mother in stunned silence. The room began to spin from the blood loss. "Get out," she commanded, taking a sip of her tea. "Before I call the police and have you committed to a psychiatric ward." They drove me to a free clinic across town, dropped me at the curb without a word, and drove away. Over the next 7 years, they weaponized that incident to destroy my reputation. Richard and Evelyn told every relative, every family friend, and every business associate in their circle that I had suffered a severe psychotic break. They claimed I smashed their antique cabinet in a violent fit of rage and cut my own wrist for attention. They used a joint access loophole they had forced me to sign at 18 to drain my remaining bank accounts, citing medical expenses they never paid. They left me on the street with a bandaged arm, $0, and a manufactured reputation as an unstable, violent liability. For 7 years, I was the cautionary tale whispered about at their country club dinners. I ate discarded food from bakery dumpsters. I slept in a rented room without heating. I worked 3 exhausting jobs while finishing my financial degree online. I built a career in the unforgiving sector of distressed asset management, fueled by a singular burning focus that kept me awake through the coldest nights. The biting chill of the marble floor brings me snapping back to the current reality of the Greenwich estate. My palms are bleeding. The sharp shards of the water goblet remain embedded in my skin. Vanessa stands above me, her hands resting on her hips, waiting for me to start wiping the floor with the dirty napkin. Richard glares down his chest, heaving with arrogant satisfaction. Evelyn watches from the head table, swirling a fresh glass of expensive wine. They expect me to break. They expect the penniless, unstable daughter to cry, to apologize, to scramble on her hands and knees and beg for mercy in front of the city's elite. I look at the dark blood dripping from my hands onto the pristine white marble. I do not feel the sting of the glass in my palms. I do not feel the humiliation of the stained suit clinging to my back. I feel the heavy, solid weight of the power resting quietly in my pocket. I press my bleeding hands flat against the cold floor and push myself up. I ignore the fresh surge of pain. I stand tall, squaring my shoulders, towering over the broken glass and the spilled wine. "Get moving!" Richard barks, pointing a stiff finger toward the service exit doors. I look at the blood coating my fingers. I wipe it slowly and deliberately across the lapel of my ruined jacket, leaving a dark, rust-colored smear across the fabric. I meet Richard's gaze. My expression holds no fear, no sorrow, and no submission. My face is a mask of pure, calculated intent. The guests watch in breathless silence, waiting for the final breakdown they were promised. They do not realize that the blood on the floor is the final toll for a debt that is about to be called in. I pulled my hands from the ruined crystals scattered across the floor. The sharp edges released their bite, leaving deep red trails across my palms. I did not search the crowd of staring guests for sympathy. I bent down and picked up the soiled linen napkin Vanessa had hurled at my face. I wrapped the fabric tightly around my bleeding skin, twisting the ends to apply pressure. The coarse material scratched against the open cuts, but I kept my breathing steady. I turned my back on the silent ballroom, leaving Richard and his elite guests standing among the spilled wine. I pushed through the heavy mahogany doors and stepped into the quiet expanse of the estate hallway. The muffled sound of the jazz band faded behind me, replaced by the steady rhythm of my own footsteps. I needed to reach the washroom to secure the makeshift bandage, but a distinct voice echoing from the nearby library halted my advance. It was Richard. I was not managing the catering staff or greeting late arrivals. He was managing a different kind of crisis. I stepped into the shadows near the open oak doors and observed the scene unfolding inside the dimly lit room. Marcus Coleman stood backed against a towering bookshelf. My new brother-in-law was a brilliant software engineer. He had spent the last 5 years coding a revolutionary data security platform from a cramped garage, turning it into a highly profitable tech startup. Marcus was intelligent, but he possessed a fatal vulnerability in this specific environment. He was a self-made African-American man striving for acceptance within a rigid, old-money white establishment. He desperately sought Richard's approval to validate his place in the family. Richard knew this. He preyed on it with practiced precision. Richard loomed over Marcus, trapping the younger man between a heavy antique desk and the wall. Richard held a silver pen in one hand and a thick stack of legal papers in the other. "Do not mind that cleaning girl, Marcus," Richard said smoothly, his tone dripping with fake paternal affection. "She is just a minor disturbance. We have bigger things to secure tonight. The party is wrapping up, and the bank needs these capital contribution forms filed by tomorrow morning. Sign right here on the dotted line, and your startup officially joins the Pierce family portfolio." I leaned closer to the doorframe, my eyes locking onto the document resting on the polished desk. My daily routine involved dismantling fraudulent financial structures. I spent thousands of hours reviewing toxic asset portfolios and bankrupt corporate shells. I did not need to read the fine print to recognize the specific formatting of the paperwork Richard was pushing. It was not a capital contribution form. It was a cross-collateralization mortgage agreement. Richard was bleeding cash. His event planning company was hollowed out by reckless spending and mounting liabilities. The Greenwich estate rental, the premium catering, and Vanessa's designer gown were all financed on credit he did not possess. To avoid immediate foreclosure, Richard needed a pristine, unencumbered asset to pledge to his aggressive creditors. Marcus's tech startup held proprietary algorithms worth millions. Richard was tricking Marcus into pledging his core intellectual property as collateral for the Pierce family's hidden debt. If Richard defaulted on a single payment, the bank would seize Marcus's life work. Richard was using his daughter's wedding to rob his new son-in-law blind. Marcus hesitated. He looked down at the dense legal jargon filling the pages. He adjusted his collar, visibly uncomfortable under Richard's intense scrutiny. "Richard, I usually have my legal team review these filings." Marcus stated, his voice respectful but tense. "The intellectual property clauses seem broad for a standard family investment. I want to make sure my engineering team is protected." Richard let out a loud, condescending sigh. He placed a heavy hand on Marcus's shoulder, squeezing hard enough to make the younger man flinch. "Marcus, we are family now. You are marrying my daughter. Do you think I would steer you wrong? We operate on trust in this circle. Bringing in outside lawyers right now shows a severe lack of faith. Vanessa will be heartbroken if she finds out you are treating her father like a hostile corporate raider. Just sign the document and let us go celebrate your new life." Marcus looked toward the hallway, his desire to keep the peace battling his sharp business instincts. He raised the silver pen, positioning the metal tip just inches above the signature line. I was choosing the illusion of family acceptance over his own financial security. He was walking right into a slaughterhouse designed specifically for him. I tightened the blood-soaked napkin around my hand. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly into the center of the library. I lifted my right foot and brought the hard heel of my shoe down with blunt force against the hardwood floor. The sharp crack echoed off the wood-paneled walls like a gunshot. Both men jolted. Marcus dropped his hand, the pen slipping from his grip and clattering onto the desk. Richard spun around his face, contorting into an ugly mask of pure rage. He recognized the stained suit and the bleeding hands instantly. "I told security to throw you out," Richard snarled, taking a threatening step away from the desk. "Get out of this room before I have you arrested for trespassing." I ignored Richard entirely. I kept my gaze fixed squarely on the groom. "Mr. Coleman," I said, my voice steady and piercing, "do you know that Clause 4B in that document means you lose your entire company?" Marcus blinked, confusion washing over his features. He looked from me to the papers on the desk. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone guarded. Richard said, "This is a standard capital injection to merge our resources." "Richard is lying," I stated, walking closer to the desk, ensuring my blood did not drip onto the Persian rug. "That is a cross-collateralization pledge. Clause 4B specifically binds your startup's patents to Pierce Events' corporate liabilities. If his company defaults on a single loan payment, his creditors possess the legal right to liquidate your software platform to cover his shortfall. He is not investing in your future. He is using your intellectual property as a human shield to delay his own bankruptcy." Marcus stepped back from the desk, his eyes widening as the reality of my words registered. He reached for the document, quickly flipping to the 4th page. His eyes scanned the dense paragraphs. His jaw tightened. The respectful son-in-law demeanor vanished, replaced by the cold focus of a tech chief executive officer who just caught a predator in his boardroom. Richard's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He lunged across the desk, attempting to snatch the papers out of Marcus's hands. "She is a delusional psychopath," Richard shouted, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "Do not listen to a word she says. She is a disgruntled former employee trying to ruin Vanessa's wedding out of pure jealousy. Give me the papers, Marcus." Marcus held the document out of Richard's reach. He read the text again, his expression hardening into granite. The tension in the library thickened, suffocating and volatile. Richard realized his trap was failing. He turned his unhinged fury toward me, his hands curling into tight fists. He took a heavy step in my direction, preparing to unleash the violence he had held back in the ballroom. Richard spun toward me, his face twisted into an ugly snarl. He raised his right hand high, curling his fingers into a tight, heavy fist. The muscles in his neck strained against his starched collar as he prepared to deliver a brutal, open-handed strike across my face. I stood my ground, my posture rigid, refusing to flinch or offer him the satisfaction of seeing me cower. Before his hand could connect, Evelyn rushed into the library from the adjacent hallway. The heavy oak doors banged against the walls behind her. She moved with frantic speed, her heels clicking loudly against the hardwood floor. She lunged between us, grabbing Richard's raised forearm and jerking it downward with surprising force. "Stop it, Richard," she hissed, shooting a nervous glance toward Marcus, who was still reading the disputed contract near the desk. "Not here, not in front of him." Evelyn did not wait for her husband to argue. She turned her sharp gaze on me. Her perfectly manicured hand shot out, clamping around my upper arm. Her fingernails dug painfully into my skin through the thin fabric of my ruined jacket. She dragged me backward out of the library and hauled me forcefully down a narrow, dimly lit service corridor. We stumbled past a row of startled waitstaff carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres. She pushed me into a small, windowless bridal dressing room and slammed the heavy door shut. The sharp click of the deadbolt locking echoed loudly in the confined space. The room smelled of expensive hairspray, wilted white roses, and stale perfume. The bright vanity mirror illuminated the harsh lines around my mother's mouth. Evelyn marched over to a small velvet armchair in the corner. She snatched a battered, overstuffed manila folder resting on the seat cushion and slammed it down onto the glass vanity table with a loud smack. Dust motes danced in the glaring light. "You want to destroy the only gold mine this family has left," Evelyn snarled. She stepped close, pressing her index finger painted a glossy blood red aggressively against my chest. "You want to walk into that library and ruin the single transaction keeping us out of bankruptcy court." I looked down at the folder. The edges were frayed, the tab bearing a faded medical insignia. The contents represented the darkest, most humiliating period of my entire life. The conflict in the room shifted rapidly from physical intimidation to calculated extortion. "Shut your mouth right now and walk out the back door of this estate," Evelyn commanded, her voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "Leave Marcus and the contract alone. If you interfere again, I will walk straight to the local precinct and hand this medical file directly to the chief of police. I will make sure the entire city knows about your little pharmaceutical habit." The depth of her depravity was staggering. 4 years ago, I secured a highly competitive financial internship at a premier investment bank in Chicago. It was the crucial first step toward my independence. Weeks before my start date, local authorities raided my small apartment. They discovered a massive stockpile of illegal heavy-grade neurological painkillers hidden under my floorboards. I did not purchase those pills. I did not consume those pills. Evelyn did. My mother had secretly stolen my Social Security number and forged my signature on multiple medical release forms. She utilized my clean record to purchase bulk quantities of controlled narcotics from a corrupt local pharmacy. She then sold those pills on the black market to maintain the Pierce family's lavish lifestyle when Richard's business first began hemorrhaging cash. When the authorities closed in on the illegal pharmacy ring, Evelyn panicked. She meticulously fabricated a deeply disturbing medical history, creating a paper trail that painted me as a severe, long-term opioid addict. She planted the surplus drugs in my apartment and tipped off the police. She framed her own daughter to avoid federal prison. The resulting police investigation obliterated my Chicago internship. I lost my housing, my professional reputation, and nearly my freedom. The charges were eventually dropped due to a technicality regarding the search warrant, but the damage was permanent. Evelyn used that fabricated file to label me as a delusional addict to our entire social circle, justifying my expulsion from the family. Now she was using her own monstrous crime as leverage to force me into silence while she robbed Marcus blind. I stared at the thick manila folder resting on the glass table. I did not tremble. I did not scream. A slow, chilling smile touched the corners of my mouth. I reached up with my bandaged hand and casually adjusted the lapel of my stained jacket. My thumb brushed against the small dark button disguised seamlessly as a thread closure near my collarbone. A tiny, almost imperceptible red light blinked once, confirming the microscopic recording device secured beneath the fabric was actively capturing audio. "Are you extorting me with a federal identity fraud scheme, Mother?" I asked. I maintained a calm, steady tone, ensuring every syllable was clear and distinct in the quiet room. "You are threatening to release medical records that you forged using my stolen Social Security number to cover up your illegal narcotics distribution." Evelyn let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She crossed her arms, radiating an aura of untouchable arrogance. She leaned closer, her eyes glittering with malicious triumph. "Do you really think anyone cares about the truth, Audrey?" she sneered. "Do you think a single judge, a single police officer, or a single investor will believe the desperate ramblings of an unemployed, mentally unstable addict over a respected pillar of the Greenwich community? I have the paperwork. I have the doctor's signatures. I have the narrative. You have absolutely nothing. Nobody will believe a pathetic loser like you." Evelyn smiled, convinced she held the ultimate trump card. She believed her wealth, her social standing, and her intricate web of lies provided impenetrable armor. She was entirely confident that her extortion would secure Marcus's signature and save the Pierce family empire. She did not know that a heavily armed team of federal agents from the Economic Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation was currently parked in a black surveillance van just outside the estate's main gates. She did not know that my lapel microphone was transmitting her confession directly to a secure server monitored by a senior federal prosecutor. She did not know that her arrogant admission of identity theft and extortion had just provided the final piece of evidence necessary to execute a sweeping federal indictment. Evelyn believed she was burying me. She had no idea she was actively digging her own grave. Evelyn's cruel, triumphant laugh still hung in the stagnant air of the bridal suite when the world around her abruptly plunged into darkness. The massive crystal chandeliers illuminating the grand estate flickered wildly, emitting a sharp electric crackle before dying completely. The sudden blackout swallowed the luxurious venue whole. A heavy, suffocating silence descended for a fraction of a second, immediately shattered by a shrill, piercing shriek from the estate's central PA system. The feedback loop echoed violently down the corridors, a chaotic alarm signaling a total infrastructural collapse. The heavy door of the dressing room flew open, smashing violently against the wall. The emergency backup lights cast long, eerie shadows across the panicked faces flooding the hallway. The estate's executive chef, a burly man whose white uniform was stained with sweat and culinary disaster, barged through the frantic crowd. He ignored the elite guests, his eyes locked furiously on Richard, who had just emerged from the library. "Your corporate credit cards just declined for the third time," Richard the chef roared. His booming voice easily overpowered the murmuring of the confused, wealthy attendees. "The supplier just canceled the entire secondary shipment. They are refusing to unload the main course until the invoice clears. My entire kitchen staff is walking out. We are done here. The service is officially suspended." The polished veneer of the high society wedding cracked instantly. Outrage rippled through the 200 elite guests. Murmurs of confusion morphed rapidly into sharp, indignant complaints. Prominent investors and local politicians, unaccustomed to such glaring logistical failures, began demanding explanations. The darkness and the blatant economic disaster choked the previously festive atmosphere, replacing the elegant jazz with the harsh, undeniable reality of financial ruin. Vanessa scrambled out of the grand ballroom, her heavy satin gown dragging awkwardly in the dim emergency lighting. The carefully constructed image of the blushing, radiant bride had vanished. Her face was pale, her makeup smudged. She spotted Marcus standing near the library entrance holding the disputed contract, his expression caught between deep concern and rising suspicion. Vanessa launched herself at him, her hands clawing desperately at his tuxedo jacket. "It is just a minor glitch with the banking servers, Marcus," she pleaded, her voice pitched unnaturally high. A frantic manufactured sweetness masked the raw panic underneath. "Just sign the papers right now. Dad will wire the funds and we can fix this mess before the guests leave. Please, baby, just sign it so we can save the reception." Marcus did not move the pen. He looked down at Vanessa's trembling hands, then at the furious chef, and finally at Richard. The pieces of the puzzle were rapidly aligning in the tech CEO's mind, and the picture forming was incredibly ugly. Richard unraveled. The carefully curated facade of the wealthy, in-control patriarch disintegrated completely. The veins in his forehead bulged against his skin. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, scanned the chaotic hallway, landing squarely on me as I stepped calmly out of the dressing room, the forged medical file still visible on the vanity behind me. His desperation needed a target, and I was the designated scapegoat. "It is her!" Richard bellowed, his voice cracking with unhinged fury. He pointed a rigid, trembling finger directly at my chest. "She hacked the bank servers. She is a disgruntled psycho trying to sabotage my business." He spun toward the 4 heavily built private security guards stationed near the ballroom entrance. "Grab her," Richard ordered, his tone devoid of any rational thought. "Detain that worthless rat right now. Search her pockets. Confiscate her phone. She is behind this entire blackout." The 4 guards trained to follow the highest-paying client did not hesitate. They surged forward, a wall of dark suits and aggressive muscle, moving to execute an illegal detainment based on the frantic ravings of a desperate man. Evelyn stepped out of the dressing room, an expression of malicious glee spreading across her features. She watched the guards close the distance, eagerly anticipating the physical humiliation of the daughter she despised. 2 of the men reached me simultaneously. Heavy, rough hands clamped down hard on my shoulders. They wrenched my arms backward with brutal force, ignoring the blood-soaked napkin wrapped tightly around my injured palm. The sharp, agonizing sting of the embedded glass flared intensely, sending a fresh wave of fire up my arm, but I did not cry out. I locked my jaw, staring straight into Richard's frantic, bloodshot eyes. I let them hold me. The physical assault only added to the overwhelming mountain of evidence piling up against them. The guards prepared to force me to my knees to begin an invasive search, but a sharp, resonant sound cut through the mounting hysteria. A single metallic clink, a heavy silver spoon striking a crystal champagne flute. The sound did not come from the chaotic hallway. It originated from the raised dais inside the main ballroom. The sharp, commanding noise sliced through the panic, the shouted accusations, and the darkness. It was a sound demanding absolute, immediate attention, delivered with an authority that dwarfed Richard's frantic yelling. The security guards froze their grip on my arms, loosening slightly in surprise. Richard stopped mid-rant, his head whipping toward the source of the noise. Evelyn's malicious smile faltered. The angry murmurs of the 200 guests died down instantly. Every eye in the dim, chaotic venue turned toward the main stage, waiting for the figure standing by the microphone to speak. The frantic, spiraling collapse of the Pierce family momentarily paused, suspended in the heavy silence, following that single decisive strike of silver against crystal. Judge Harrison Thorne stood perfectly still at the center of the raised dais. The estate backup generator roared to life in the distance, sending a surge of electricity into the essential public address system and casting the grand ballroom in a stark, unyielding amber glow. Thorne was not merely a wedding officiant hired for a weekend ceremony. He held a lifetime appointment on the state appellate bench. I was a formidable jurist who dismantled corrupt corporate monopolies and jailed fraudulent executives before his morning coffee. His presence alone commanded profound respect. Right now, he held a heavy silver spoon against the rim of a crystal champagne flute. The sharp, rhythmic strikes pierced the suffocating panic of the elite guests. The wealthy attendees froze in their tracks. The frantic, disorganized murmurs died instantly. The venture capitalists, the local politicians, and the silent partners all turned their attention toward the stage. Richard heard the commanding sound and executed a rapid, jarring psychological pivot. The unhinged predator vanished instantly, replaced by the polished, charismatic patriarch of the Pierce family. He needed to salvage his reputation in front of his wealthy peers. Richard snapped his fingers at the 4 security guards restraining my arms. He offered a sharp, upward jerk of his chin. The heavy hands released my torn jacket. I stood firm, hiding the sharp wince as the blood rushed back into my aching shoulders. Richard smoothed his lapels. He forced a wide, practiced smile onto his flushed face, displaying bright white teeth that lacked any genuine warmth. He stepped away from the shadowy hallway and moved toward the edge of the ballroom floor, projecting his voice to reach the back rows. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this minor distraction," Richard announced, using the smooth, reassuring cadence he utilized to charm naive investors. "Please remain calm. We are just experiencing a brief technical glitch with the secondary power grid. My staff is handling the catering dispute as we speak. As for the commotion back here, it is nothing more than a minor disciplinary issue with a bottom-feeder janitorial worker who stepped far out of line. We will have the garbage removed shortly." Richard took a confident step toward the dais, extending his hand as if to take the microphone from the judge and resume control of the narrative. He expected swift compliance. He expected the machinery of high society to cover his tracks and protect his fragile ego. Judge Thorne did not hand over the microphone. He did not return the friendly smile. He raised his left hand, holding his palm flat and rigid toward Richard. The gesture was a physical barricade, a silent judicial order demanding an immediate halt. Richard stopped mid-stride, his fake smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Thorne reached inside the breast pocket of his ceremonial black robe. He did not pull out a prayer book or a marriage certificate. He withdrew a thick folded stack of legal parchment. The heavy paper bore a distinct glaring mark. A crimson embossed wax seal of the State Commercial Court glowed under the amber emergency lights. The judge unfolded the document with deliberate, agonizing slowness. He leaned into the microphone. His voice, amplified by the battery-powered speakers, rolled across the silent ballroom like approaching thunder. "We cannot continue this ceremony," Judge Thorne proclaimed. The authoritative timbre of his voice offered no room for debate. The legal finality in his tone caused the remaining color to drain from Vanessa's face. Richard bristled, his fists clenching at his sides. "Harrison, what are you doing?" Richard hissed under his breath, attempting to keep his rising panic hidden from the front row of elite guests. "The caterers are just throwing a fit over a delayed wire transfer. Read the vows. Get Marcus to the altar." Judge Thorne ignored the desperate whisper. He kept his steely gaze fixed on the back of the room, looking directly over Richard's head. "We cannot proceed with any rituals, vows, or celebrations tonight." The judge continued, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I have just received a binding injunction directly from the commercial docket. As an officer of the court, I am legally obligated to halt all proceedings on this property until the verified financial backer of this entire event steps forward. We must yield the floor to the individual who holds the actual legal deed to this estate." A strange, tense energy crackled through the crowd. Whispers ignited among the hedge fund managers and bank executives. They smelled blood in the water. They recognized the language of corporate foreclosure. Richard heard the judge's decree and processed the information through a lens of staggering, impenetrable hubris. His frantic mind twisted the dire legal warning into a grand theatrical introduction. He genuinely believed Judge Thorne was attempting to restore order by reminding the panicked crowd of the Pierce family's immense wealth and unyielding authority. Richard threw his head back and let out a booming, arrogant laugh. The sound was harsh, hollow, and painfully oblivious to the reality closing in around him. He patted his chest, projecting false humility. "Harrison, you are far too kind." Richard chuckled, taking another confident step toward the stage, ready to claim his throne. "There is no need for such a dramatic formal introduction. But since you insist on honoring the host, I suppose I should say a few words to reassure our esteemed guests. As the master of the Pierce family and the sole provider for this magnificent celebration, I assure you all that the Pierce legacy remains secure." Richard reached for the microphone stand, his fingers brushing the cold metal. Judge Thorne pulled the stand back, keeping it firmly out of Richard's grasp. The judge looked down at the man who had spent 30 years building an empire on lies, stolen credit, and the merciless exploitation of his own daughter. The judge's expression held zero pity. "You are not the master here, Richard," Judge Thorne stated. His voice was a razor slicing cleanly through the thick silence of the ballroom. Richard froze, his hands suspended in empty air. The arrogant smirk shattered into 1,000 pieces. The confident posture dissolved, leaving behind the hunched frame of a terrified fraud. "You do not own this estate." Thorne continued, reading directly from the sealed commercial injunction. "You did not fund this wedding. Your corporate accounts are frozen. Your personal assets are liquidated. You have zero equity to your name. You are not a host. You are a debtor." The word dropped like an anvil in the center of the room. Debtor. In the ruthless hierarchy of Greenwich high society, there was no label more toxic, no status more degrading. The elite guests physically recoiled. The men who had been shaking Richard's hand hours earlier now exchanged knowing, disdainful glances. The women who had praised Evelyn's expensive taste now stared at her with undisguised contempt. Richard staggered back a step, the breath knocked out of his lungs. He looked at the heavy parchment in the judge's hand, recognizing the official seal of his own financial doom. He opened his mouth to argue, to deny the accusation, to spin one final lie, but his vocal cords failed him. The crushing weight of his hidden bankruptcy had finally caught up to him, dragged into the harsh light by a judge who refused to play along with the charade. I stood in the shadows of the hallway, the blood from my palms soaking the crude linen bandage. I watched the mighty Richard Pierce shrink under the crushing weight of public exposure. The foundation of his fraudulent empire had just been vaporized. The stage was finally set for the true owner of the estate to step out of the dark and claim her rightful property. I stepped out of the dimly lit service corridor and into the amber glow of the emergency backup lights. My cheap suit jacket stuck uncomfortably to my skin, saturated with the sour, heavy scent of drying Cabernet. A fresh, dark line of blood slipped from beneath the crude linen napkin wrapped tightly around my left hand. The crimson drops traced a path down my wrist to splatter onto the polished marble floor. I did not break my stride. Every step I took toward the raised dais was measured sharp and lethal. The crowd parted involuntarily. Men in bespoke tuxedos and women in haute couture physically stepped aside, repelled by the sight of the blood and wine, yet magnetized by the sheer undeniable gravity of my approach. Richard stood frozen at the base of the stage. His brain rejected the visual information unfolding right in front of him. The outcast daughter he had just assaulted was walking directly toward the seat of power. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice cracking, shedding its polished, authoritative baritone. "Get back to the alley right now. Guards, remove her from this room immediately." The 4 private security guards shifted uneasily on their feet. They looked at Richard, then at Judge Thorne, who still held the sealed commercial injunction near the podium. The guards did not move an inch. They were private contractors paid to protect the legal property owner, and a state appellate judge had just announced to 200 people that Richard held no such title. The chain of command had fractured, leaving Richard barking orders into a void. I bypassed my father without offering him a single glance. I climbed the 3 carpeted steps to the dais. Judge Harrison Thorne turned to face me. He did not offer a pitying look at my stained clothes or my bleeding hands. He offered a short, crisp nod of professional recognition between 2 individuals who understood the ruthless, unforgiving mechanics of commercial law. He extended his arm and handed the heavy metal microphone directly to me. I gripped the microphone. The cold steel grounded me. I looked out over the sea of 200 wealthy guests. I found Richard standing below the stage, his eyes wide, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. "My name is Audrey," I said. My voice projected through the emergency speakers, steady and cold, devoid of any anger or sorrow. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Zenith Capital Investment Fund." The name triggered an immediate visceral reaction across the room. Zenith Capital was a known apex predator in the corporate restructuring sector. Several venture capitalists in the front rows stiffened, exchanging alarmed glances. They knew the fund. They respected the fund's aggressive market strategies. They simply had never connected the notoriously secretive acquisition firm to the discarded, allegedly unstable daughter of Richard Pierce. I reached into the inner pocket of my ruined jacket with my uninjured right hand. I withdrew a thick folded stack of financial disclosures and bank ledgers. As of 8 o'clock this morning, I continued holding the documents up high for the room to see Zenith Capital finalized a hostile acquisition of Pierce Events' entire liability portfolio. We purchased $14 million in defaulted commercial loans, unpaid vendor invoices, and delinquent high-interest mortgages across 7 different banking institutions. I tossed the heavy stack of bank statements and transfer deeds onto the wooden podium. The thick paper landed with a dull, resonant thud that echoed over the speakers. This paperwork confirms the transfer of all primary liens. Zenith Capital now holds the senior debt on every single asset attached to the Pierce family name. I stepped out from behind the podium, moving to the very edge of the stage to look directly down at Richard. I wanted him to hear every syllable. I wanted his elite peers to witness the exact anatomical breakdown of his fraudulent empire. "Look around you, Richard," I said, sweeping my hand across the grand ballroom. "This historic Greenwich estate. The vintage champagne currently sitting in your guests' crystal glasses. The imported floral arrangements lining the aisles. None of this belongs to you." My gaze shifted to Vanessa. She stood near the bridal arch, clutching the heavy skirts of her pristine gown, her face a mask of mounting horror. Even the custom Vera Wang dress my sister is wearing right now was purchased on a revolving corporate credit line that my firm now owns. Every square inch of this luxury, every thread of silk, and every drop of wine is collateralized by capital that belongs to me. I turned my attention back to the crowd, exposing the timeline of his deception to the very investors he had hoped to con. Richard Pierce has been operating a shadow bankruptcy for the last 6 months. He leveraged his event company into terminal insolvency to maintain the illusion of high society wealth. He invited you all here tonight to secure new investments under false pretenses, using his daughter's wedding as a glossy, expensive distraction to mask a failing balance sheet. I looked back at Richard, the man who had kicked my chair out from under me, the man who had watched my mother pour wine over my head while he smirked. "You told your guests I was a worthless parasite." I stated my tone lethal and exact. "You told me you hired me as a $15 an hour valet to keep me hidden in the parking lot. You did not hire me, Richard. I bought your toxic debt for pennies on the dollar because your creditors knew you were a sinking ship with zero liquidity." I took a deep breath, delivering the final fatal blow to his legacy. "I did not come to this estate to park cars or clean your floors. I came here today in my capacity as your senior creditor to execute an active on-site asset foreclosure." The final word hung in the air, a definitive death sentence for the Pierce dynasty. The grand ballroom erupted. The heavy silence shattered into a deafening roar of shocked whispers, outraged gasps, and frantic inquiries. Business partners pulled out their phones, rapidly dialing their own legal teams to assess their financial exposure to Richard's toxic fallout. The facade of the untouchable Pierce family was obliterated in real time. I watched Richard's face transition through a horrifying spectrum of defeat. The furious flushed red of his earlier arrogance drained away in an instant. His skin turned a sickly, translucent white, resembling a corpse drained of all its blood. His knees buckled slightly, no longer able to support the staggering weight of his own hubris. He reached out to grip the edge of a nearby dining table, his knuckles turning white as he fought to keep himself from collapsing onto the marble floor. The man who had ruled his family through fear, financial manipulation, and physical intimidation was now a bankrupt fraud. He had been publicly stripped of his power, his wealth, and his social standing. He stood exposed before his peers entirely at the mercy of the daughter he had thrown out onto the street. I looked down at him from the podium, feeling no pity, no regret, and no desire for reconciliation. The ledger was finally balanced. The initial shockwave of the foreclosure announcement still reverberated through the ballroom when Evelyn snapped. The refined country club matriarch vanished, replaced instantly by a cornered feral animal. She let out a high-pitched guttural shriek that scraped against the eardrums of every guest in the room. She shoved her way past a cluster of stunned hedge fund managers, discarding any pretense of upper-class dignity. Her heavy diamond necklace swung wildly against her collarbone as she practically sprinted up the 3 steps of the dais, lunging toward the podium where I stood. "She is lying," Evelyn shrieked, her voice cracking with desperate, unhinged hysteria. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me, turning frantically to face Judge Thorne and the staring crowd. "She is a delusional psychopath. She does not own any investment firm. She has been suffering from severe hallucinations for years." Evelyn reached into her designer handbag and yanked out the battered manila folder she had used to threaten me in the dressing room. The frayed edges of the medical file flapped as she raised it high above her head like a trophy. "She is a chronic, institutionalized narcotic addict," Evelyn screamed to the 200 silent guests, determined to assassinate my character before her own crimes could be exposed. "She has a documented criminal medical history. She was arrested in Chicago for hoarding heavy painkillers. Do not listen to a single word she says. Look at the files. Look at the proof." With a violent, sweeping motion, Evelyn hurled the thick folder directly at my face. The heavy clasp broke upon impact with the podium. Dozens of forged medical evaluations, falsified prescription logs, and fake psychological assessments exploded into the air, fluttering down around my feet like dirty snow. The chaotic shower of paper covered the blood drops on the stage. I did not flinch. I did not bend down to gather the scattered pages. I stood perfectly still, letting Evelyn's desperate character assassination ring hollow against the cold, hard reality I was about to unleash. Judge Thorne stepped forward, his heavy black robe swishing around his ankles. He looked down at the scattered papers littering the stage, then fixed Evelyn with a gaze devoid of any judicial mercy. "Mrs. Pierce, those medical files are entirely fabricated," Judge Thorne stated. His voice was a heavy gavel striking the podium. "The federal agents assigned to the Economic Crimes Division have already cross-referenced the physician signatures you painstakingly copied. The doctors listed on those documents never treated your daughter. The prescriptions were never authorized for her use." Evelyn froze. Her mouth opened, but no sound escaped. The frantic energy drained from her limbs as the judge's words dismantled her primary weapon. "You forged those documents yourself," Mrs. Pierce Thorne continued, his tone clinical and precise. "You utilized your daughter's stolen Social Security number to acquire illegal narcotics, which you then distributed on the black market to sustain your failing lifestyle. You framed her to protect yourself from federal prosecution. The court is fully aware of your operation." I reached up with my uninjured hand and grasped the lapel of my wine-soaked jacket. I located the small hidden button near my collarbone and pressed it firmly. The tiny red light of the concealed microphone deactivated. I reached into my side pocket, pulled out the compact receiver unit, and connected it directly into the auxiliary port of the estate's emergency sound system resting on the podium shelf. I pressed play. The audio file was crisp and ungarbled. Evelyn's own cruel, arrogant voice blasted through the massive ballroom speakers, echoing off the high ceilings and crashing over the stunned crowd. "If you interfere again, I will walk straight to the local precinct and hand this medical file directly to the chief of police. I will make sure the entire city knows about your little pharmaceutical habit." The recording paused for a second before my own voice responded on the tape. "Are you extorting me with a federal identity fraud scheme, Mother? You are threatening to release medical records that you forged using my stolen Social Security number." Evelyn's mocking, triumphant laugh followed, filling the quiet room with chilling clarity. "Do you really think anyone cares about the truth, Audrey? Do you think a single judge will believe a pathetic loser like you? I have the paperwork. I have the narrative. You have absolutely nothing. Nobody will believe a pathetic loser like you." I hit the stop button. The silence that followed was suffocating. The recording did not just prove the forgery. It broadcast her malicious intent, her calculated cruelty, and her arrogant belief that her wealth made her untouchable. The elite guests, the billionaire partners, and the high society friends physically recoiled. The men and women who had dined at Evelyn's table, who had donated to her charities, now stared at her with expressions of profound, unconcealed disgust. The social hierarchy of Greenwich abhorred many things, but federal identity theft and the malicious framing of one's own child were unforgivable transgressions. The crowd instinctively stepped back, widening the empty space around the dais, treating Evelyn like an active contagion. Medical identity fraud and the illegal distribution of controlled narcotics are severe federal felonies. Judge Thorne declared, his voice carrying the finality of a prison sentence. Extortion using those forged documents escalates the charges exponentially. 4 individuals seated discreetly near the back of the ballroom stood up in unison. They did not wear tuxedos. They wore plain dark suits. They moved down the central aisle with practiced, coordinated efficiency, cutting through the parted crowd. They were federal agents from the FBI's Economic Crimes Division, and they had heard enough. Evelyn saw the agents approaching, the polished, untouchable matriarch completely shattered. Her knees buckled under the weight of her impending incarceration. She collapsed onto the hard stage, her expensive dress pooling around her as she scrambled desperately toward the edge of the dais. Richard, Evelyn wailed, reaching out to claw at her husband's pant leg. Her voice was unrecognizable, a pathetic, ragged plea. "Richard, do something. Call the lawyers. Tell them I was trying to protect the company. Stop them, Richard." Richard did not look down at his wife. He did not reach out to help her up. He stood rigidly near the front table, his eyes locked in a hollow stare on the stack of Zenith Capital foreclosure documents resting on the podium. He was a man entirely consumed by his own financial annihilation. He could not process the sight of federal agents advancing on his wife because his brain was completely saturated by the realization that he was penniless. The lead FBI agent reached the stage. He did not read Evelyn her rights softly. He grabbed her arm, hauling her roughly to her feet. He pulled her hands behind her back, the sharp metallic ratcheting sound of steel handcuffs locking securely around her wrists, cutting through the quiet room. Evelyn twisted her neck, looking back at me as the agents began to drag her down the aisle. The hatred in her eyes was replaced by stark, unadulterated terror. "Audrey, please." Evelyn sobbed, her tears ruining her pristine makeup. "I am your mother. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Please, Audrey." I looked down at the woman who had stolen my identity, ruined my career, and thrown me onto the street with bleeding hands. I met her terrified gaze with absolute unyielding silence. I did not smile. I did not sneer. I simply watched the agents escort her out the heavy double doors, letting the cold reality of her federal indictment serve as her final answer. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind the federal agents, sealing Evelyn's fate and plunging the ballroom back into a stunned, breathless quiet. The scent of spilled wine and shattered illusions hung heavy in the air. Richard remained rooted to the spot, a hollowed-out shell staring blankly at the foreclosure documents on the podium. The silence was abruptly broken by a harsh, guttural scream. Vanessa tore herself away from the bridal arch. She grabbed the elaborate, cascading bouquet of imported white orchids and hurled it violently to the marble floor. The delicate petals bruised and scattered across the slick surface, mingling with the drying blood and wine. Her face, meticulously contoured for wedding photographs, contorted into an ugly, unrecognizable mask of pure, unadulterated venom. The golden child of the Pierce family was losing her grip on the fantasy she had so ruthlessly cultivated. "You ruined everything!" Vanessa shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the cavernous room. She stomped toward the dais, her heavy satin train dragging awkwardly behind her. "This was supposed to be my perfect day. You did this because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of me. You are a pathetic, lonely spinster, and you could not stand watching me marry Marcus." She thrust her left hand forward, extending her fingers rigidly to display the massive 3-carat diamond engagement ring catching the amber emergency light. She wielded the jewelry like a weapon, a final desperate assertion of her superiority and stolen status. "You will never have this, Audrey. You will never be chosen. You are just a bitter, jealous failure." I did not flinch at her tirade. I looked at the glittering diamond on her finger, then shifted my gaze to meet her furious, tear-streaked eyes. A slow, chilling smile touched the corners of my mouth. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the calculated expression of a predator preparing to deliver the final killing blow. "Vanessa," I said, leaning closer to the microphone, ensuring my voice remained low, steady, and incredibly dangerous. "Do you know whose name is actually printed on the black American Express card you used to purchase that ring?" Vanessa froze. The frantic, venomous energy drained from her body. Her arm dropped slightly, the diamond catching a different angle of the light. She blinked, her brain struggling to process the sudden pivot in the conversation. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice losing its aggressive edge. "Dad gave me that card for the wedding expenses. It is a corporate account. It is a corporate account," I confirmed, nodding slowly. "But it does not belong to Pierce Events." I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out a single laminated sheet of banking records. I held it up for her to see, though the details were too small to read from the floor. 2 years ago, Richard realized his credit rating was completely decimated, I announced, projecting my voice across the silent ballroom. No bank would issue him a single line of credit, so he utilized the same tactic Evelyn used. He illegally accessed my frozen financial files and opened a high-limit corporate credit account using my stolen Social Security number. He handed that fraudulent card directly to you, Vanessa. Vanessa stumbled backward, her heavy gown hindering her movement. She looked at Richard silently, begging him to deny the accusation, but Richard did not move. He did not look up. His silence was a deafening confirmation. "You have spent the last 14 months living a billionaire's lifestyle on a stolen identity." I continued, mercilessly detailing her crimes to the elite crowd. the 3-carat diamond currently sitting on your finger, the $80,000 deposit for your luxury honeymoon in the Maldives, the custom Vera Wang dress you are wearing right now. Every single extravagant purchase was charged to a fraudulent account opened in my name. A collective gasp rippled through the 200 elite guests. The sophisticated veneer of the Pierce family was not just crumbling, it was being actively exposed as a crude, desperate criminal enterprise. The hedge fund managers and bank executives exchanged horrified looks, realizing they had been dining with common thieves. Vanessa shook her head frantically, her perfectly styled hair beginning to unravel. I did not know, she pleaded, her voice rising in panic. I thought it was Dad's money. I did not know it was stolen. Ignorance is not a defense against federal wire fraud, Vanessa. I replied, my tone devoid of any sisterly affection. But we both know you are not ignorant. You saw the billing statements. You saw my name on the account alerts. You simply did not care, because as long as the champagne kept flowing, you were perfectly willing to let your sister take the fall for your massive debt. I lowered the laminated sheet and looked directly into her terrified eyes. 10 minutes ago, I contacted the fraud division of American Express, I stated calmly. I officially reported every single transaction you authorized over the last 14 months as fraudulent charges executed via identity theft. That card is frozen. The debt is currently being transferred to a criminal investigation unit. Vanessa let out a small, strangled sob. She looked down at the diamond ring, no longer a symbol of status, but a physical piece of evidence tying her to a major felony. You did not marry Marcus because you love him, Vanessa, I said, turning my gaze toward the groom, standing frozen near the library entrance. I delivered the final devastating truth that shattered her entire manufactured reality. You married Marcus because you knew the federal authorities were beginning to audit Richard's accounts. You knew the credit card fraud was about to be exposed. You rushed this wedding because Marcus's successful tech startup was the only financial life raft you had left. You planned to drain his accounts to pay off your stolen debt before the FBI could issue a warrant for your arrest. The grand ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. The remaining guests recoiled from Vanessa as if she were carrying a plague. The golden child of the Pierce family, the pristine, perfect daughter who had spent her entire life looking down on me, was now publicly exposed as a desperate, manipulative criminal facing federal prison time. The immaculate facade of the Pierce dynasty had been entirely dismantled piece by piece, leaving nothing but a pile of ugly, dirty secrets scattered across their own ruined stage. Vanessa sank to her knees among the crushed orchids and spilled wine, sobbing uncontrollably, completely abandoned by the high society she had lied, cheated, and stolen to impress. Marcus Coleman stood utterly motionless in the center of the grand aisle. The heavy, gold-embossed contract Richard had aggressively shoved into his hands minutes earlier now felt like a toxic, burning weight against his palms. The vibrant, joyful atmosphere of his wedding day had evaporated, replaced by a chilling scene of profound corporate and familial destruction. Marcus looked at the crumpled form of his bride Vanessa, sobbing hysterically on the marble floor amidst the crushed orchids and spilled wine. He looked at the empty space where his new mother-in-law had been forcibly dragged away by federal agents. He looked down at the dense legal paragraphs detailing the cross-collateralization of his life's work. The brilliant software engineer, usually capable of processing complex data streams in seconds, struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the betrayal surrounding him. He had sought a family, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared ambition. He had walked directly into a meticulously designed financial slaughterhouse. Richard, sensing the groom's hesitation and realizing that his final desperate lifeline was rapidly slipping away, snapped out of his catatonic shock. He lunged across the aisle, his polished dress shoes slipping slightly on the slick marble. He grasped Marcus's forearm with a frantic, bruising grip. The arrogant, composed patriarch was completely gone. Richard was sweating profusely, his eyes darting wildly, his voice a hoarse, pleading croak. Do not listen to a single word that psychotic failure says. Marcus Richard begged, his fingers digging desperately into the fine wool of Marcus's tuxedo sleeve. She is trying to poison you against us. She is insanely jealous of Vanessa. Just sign the document. Richard shook Marcus's arm, trying to force compliance through sheer desperate willpower. Sign the guarantee right now, Marcus. I promise you, my banking partners will release the bridge loan by tomorrow morning. We will restructure the debt. We will protect the technology. But if you do not sign that paper right now, your startup will collapse. You need my capital to survive the next quarter. You will lose everything if you listen to her." The blatant lie hung in the stagnant air of the ballroom. Richard was utilizing his final rusted weapon, the illusion of his immense wealth, to manipulate Marcus into sacrificing his intellectual property. It was a pathetic, transparent bluff, a desperate gamble that the groom was too intimidated by the Greenwich elite to recognize a sinking ship. This was the exact moment I chose to deliver the second fatal blow to Richard Pierce's non-existent empire. I tapped my index finger against the metal grill of the microphone. The sharp, amplified thud cut through Richard's frantic pleading, demanding immediate attention. "Marcus," I said, my voice calm, projecting absolute unyielding authority. "I understand your software firm, Apex Security Solutions, is currently in the final stages of closing a Series A funding round. You are waiting on a $5 million capital injection from an anonymous private equity syndicate. Correct?" Marcus flinched in surprise. His head whipped up, his dark eyes locking onto mine. The details of his Series A funding were highly confidential, guarded by strict non-disclosure agreements, and known only to his executive board and his lead legal counsel. The fact that the estranged, allegedly unemployed daughter standing on the dais possessed that specific classified financial data stunned him into silence. He offered a slow, hesitant nod of confirmation. Richard frowned, momentarily distracted from his frantic extortion. He looked from Marcus to me, his brow furrowing in deep, confused lines. I leaned closer to the microphone, preparing to extinguish the very last ember of hope burning in Richard's desperate mind. "That anonymous private equity syndicate is a subsidiary portfolio managed directly by Zenith Capital," I stated clearly, letting the words echo across the silent room. "I am the lead investor underwriting that entire $5 million injection." Marcus staggered back a half step, the revelation hitting him with physical force. Richard's jaw dropped slack, his frantic grip on Marcus's arm loosening entirely as the terrifying reality of my statement registered. "Richard is lying to you, Marcus." I continued, my tone devoid of any empathy. "He does not have a bridge loan waiting. His banks have frozen his accounts. He is attempting to steal your proprietary algorithms to pawn off to his creditors to delay his own incarceration. He needs your money because he is entirely bankrupt." I pointed a firm, steady finger at the contract Marcus still held. "If you put your signature on that fraudulent cross-collateralization agreement and legally bind your startup to the toxic liabilities of Pierce Events, I will pull the Series A funding immediately," I declared, establishing an immovable financial boundary. "Zenith Capital will not invest a single dime into a firm burdened by Richard Pierce's criminal debt. You will lose the $5 million, and you will lose your company to his creditors." I lowered the microphone slightly, offering Marcus the final choice. "The decision is entirely yours, Marcus. You can sign your life's work over to a bankrupt fraud, or you can walk away right now and secure your company's future." The grand ballroom held its collective breath. The elite guests, the silent partners, and the remaining security guards all watched the groom. The tension was an immense, crushing physical weight. Marcus looked down at the heavy legal document in his hands. He read the intricate, deceptive clauses designed specifically to strip him of his intellectual property. He looked at Vanessa, who was still weeping on the floor, offering no defense, no apology, just selfish, terrified sobs. He looked at Richard, a sweaty, desperate con man, grasping at straws completely devoid of the paternal dignity he projected. Marcus did not hesitate for another second. The illusion of the perfect, welcoming family had been violently shattered, replaced by the cold, hard logic of survival. He gripped the thick stack of gold-embossed paper with both hands. With a sharp, sudden, and incredibly violent motion, Marcus ripped the contract straight down the middle. Richard gasped, lunging forward with a pathetic, strangled cry, as if trying to physically catch the torn pages before the ink could dry. "No, Marcus, what are you doing?" Richard wailed. Marcus did not stop. He folded the torn halves together and ripped them again, tearing his signature line, the fraudulent clauses, and Richard's desperate escape plan into useless, shredded confetti. He shoved the ruined pieces of paper directly into Richard's chest. The torn fragments fluttered down, covering Richard's polished shoes like a mocking snowfall. Marcus adjusted his cuffs, his posture straightening, reclaiming his dignity and his independence. He looked at Richard with an expression of profound, chilling disgust, realizing exactly how close he had come to sacrificing his entire future for a lie. The sharp, tearing sound of thick legal parchment echoed across the silent ballroom like a gunshot executing a condemned prisoner. Marcus, releasing the shredded cross-collateralization agreement, severed the very last thread holding the Pierce family empire together. The heavy gold-embossed fragments fluttered through the stale air, drifting downward in a chaotic spiral before settling over the toes of Richard's polished dress shoes. Richard stared at the ruined paperwork littering the floor. His chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths. The complex, fraudulent machinery he had spent decades building had just been dismantled in under 10 minutes. There were no more hidden accounts to drain. There were no more naive investors to manipulate. There was no remaining legal maneuver to shield him from the crushing weight of a $14 million debt and an impending federal indictment. The sophisticated, calculated persona of the Greenwich patriarch evaporated, leaving behind a feral, cornered predator. The veins in his neck bulged, pressing taut against his starched collar. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, locked onto me standing atop the dais. A primal, guttural roar ripped from his throat, a sound devoid of any human rationality. "I will kill you!" Richard bellowed, his voice cracking under the intense strain of his own rage. "I gave you life." He abandoned all pretense of civility and launched himself toward the stage. His heavy leather shoes found traction on the slick marble, propelling him forward with terrifying momentum. His hands reached out, fingers curled into rigid claws, aiming directly for my throat. He intended to silence the architect of his destruction through brute physical force, right in front of 200 witnesses. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I maintained my grip on the microphone, watching his desperate charge with cold, clinical detachment. I knew he would never reach me. Judge Harrison Thorne did not travel to high-profile commercial events without his dedicated security detail. 2 plainclothes United States Marshals assigned to protect the appellate judge and enforce the commercial injunction had been tracking Richard's escalating aggression from the perimeter of the stage. The moment Richard's foot left the floor to mount the first step of the dais, the Marshals initiated a synchronized tactical interception. They moved with blinding, practiced efficiency. The first Marshal hit Richard at waist level, driving a heavy shoulder directly into his center of mass. The sheer kinetic impact halted Richard's forward momentum instantly, lifting his feet off the ground and sending him crashing backward. The second Marshal secured Richard's flailing right arm, twisting the limb expertly behind his back in a rigid joint lock. The 2 federal officers drove the struggling, enraged man downward, slamming him face first into a nearby catering station draped in white linen. The impact was devastating. The heavy marble tabletop shuddered under the sudden weight. A towering centerpiece of imported white roses and orchids toppled over, sending a cascade of water and heavy crystal vases crashing to the floor. A pristine, long-stemmed champagne flute resting near the edge of the table was knocked loose. It plummeted toward the ground, shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces upon hitting the hard stone. The sharp, chaotic sound of the breaking glass mirrored the exact moment Richard had kicked my chair out from under me at the beginning of the reception. The irony hung thick in the air, a physical manifestation of his spectacular downfall. Richard thrashed wildly against the marble surface, sputtering enraged, incoherent threats, his cheek pressed flat against the spilled water and crushed petals. The Marshals ignored his frantic struggling. The cold, metallic, ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs, locking tightly around his wrists, echoed through the microphone still resting in my hand. The frantic scuffle ceased, leaving the former billionaire pinned securely to the ruins of his daughter's wedding feast. I stepped away from the podium and walked slowly to the edge of the stage. I looked down at the man who had tormented me for 3 decades. The crude linen napkin wrapped around my left hand was now entirely soaked through. A single dark drop of my own blood slipped from my fingertips, falling through the air to land with a quiet splash on the pristine marble floor, mere inches from Richard's constrained hands. "You claim you gave me life, Richard," I stated, bringing the microphone closer to my mouth. My voice remained steady, chillingly calm, slicing through the heavy, terrified breathing of the audience. I watched his bloodshot eyes dart frantically, searching for a way out that did not exist. You drained my grandfather's educational trust fund to finance a failing event company, stealing the very foundation of my future, I said, ensuring every guest in the room heard the precise inventory of his crimes. Your wife stole my social security number to purchase illegal narcotics on the black market, utilizing my clean record as a human shield to protect herself from federal prison. Your prized older daughter utilized a fraudulent corporate credit card issued in my name to finance her designer wardrobe and this very wedding reception. I lowered the microphone slightly, letting the harsh, undeniable truth wash over the restrained man. You did not give me life, Richard. You gave me nothing. You, Evelyn and Vanessa, functioned as parasites, feeding off my financial security, my health, and my identity to sustain a toxic illusion of wealth. You siphoned my resources until there was nothing left to take, and then you threw me onto the street. Everything you built was constructed on my stolen equity. The crowd of elite guests, hedge fund managers, and political figures processed the sheer magnitude of the exploitation. They stared at the handcuffed man pinned against the table, their expressions shifting from shock to profound self-serving horror. In the ruthless ecosystem of high-end venture capital and political maneuvering, proximity to a federal fraud investigation was a career-ending contagion. The people in this room did not care about family drama, but they cared deeply about subpoenas, SEC audits, and asset seizures. They recognized that the Pierce family was no longer a valuable social connection. They were a massive, radiating legal liability. As if governed by a single unspoken command, the entire ballroom stood up. No one stepped forward to defend Richard. No one offered a word of sympathy for the weeping bride kneeling on the floor. No one attempted to mediate the dispute. The wealthy elite prioritized self-preservation above all else. A synchronized, frantic exodus began. Chairs scraped harshly against the marble as 200 guests turned their backs on the ruined head table. The scramble for the exit was swift and ruthless. Men in tailored tuxedos shoved past each other, rushing to the coat check and the valet stand. Women hiked up their expensive gowns, their heels clicking rapidly toward the heavy mahogany double doors. They abandoned their half-empty champagne glasses, their untouched plates of artisan catering, and the sinking ship of the Pierce dynasty. The grand ballroom, which had been buzzing with laughter and arrogant celebration just half an hour earlier, transformed into a ghost town. I stood on the dais watching the exodus with cold satisfaction. I listened to the frantic squeal of tires and the roaring of luxury car engines echoing from the estate driveway as the guests fled the scene. Within 5 minutes, the massive hall was entirely empty, save for the federal agents, the remaining estate staff, and the broken remnants of my biological family. The deafening silence that settled over the room was the sound of a fraudulent empire being wiped off the map. Richard remained pinned to the table, handcuffed and humiliated, watching his entire kingdom evaporate before his eyes, realizing he was finally permanently alone. The sprawling Greenwich ballroom, recently pulsing with the elite chatter of the city's wealthiest power brokers, now felt hollow and enormous. The frantic stampede for the exits had left a chaotic wake of overturned chairs, discarded silk napkins, and abandoned luxury. The amber glow of the emergency lights cast long, harsh shadows across the debris, illuminating the total collapse of the Pierce family in stark, unforgiving detail. The heavy, metallic snap of handcuffs echoed from the rear of the hall. 2 plainclothes federal agents from the Economic Crimes Division hoisted Evelyn roughly to her feet. The polished, unyielding matriarch who had spent the evening sneering at the catering staff and demanding absolute deference was completely shattered. The facade of aristocratic superiority had dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, desperate woman facing the immediate reality of a federal holding cell. Her expensive diamond necklace hung askew. Her perfectly styled hair clung damply to her face, ruined by sweat and hysterical tears. As the agents gripped her upper arms and began to march her toward the heavy double doors, she twisted violently against their hold. Her manicured shoes slipped on the marble floor as she fought to turn her head, her frantic, bloodshot eyes locking onto me, standing silently atop the dais. "Audrey," she screamed. The sound tore from her throat, raw and jagged, entirely devoid of the honey-sweet manipulation she usually employed. "Audrey, please. Tell them to stop. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. I am your mother. I gave birth to you. You cannot let them do this to me. Audrey, please, I am begging you." She thrashed against the agent's unyielding grip, her voice rising in a panicked crescendo, pleading for the familial bond she had ruthlessly discarded the moment it became inconvenient. She weaponized her biology, hoping the mere mention of motherhood would compel me to intervene to withdraw the evidence to shield her from the federal consequences of framing her own child. I stood perfectly still, observing her desperate struggle from the elevated stage. I did not raise the microphone. I did not offer a verbal rebuttal. I simply looked at her. My expression remained a mask of cold, impenetrable granite. I offered no sympathy, no anger, and no hesitation. I deliberately turned my back on her frantic pleas, shifting my focus toward the opposite side of the room. The absolute, uncompromising silence I directed at her was a more devastating verdict than any insult I could have spoken. It was the physical manifestation of complete, irrevocable erasure. Evelyn's desperate wails pitched higher, morphing into a chaotic string of broken apologies and terrified sobs. The heavy wooden doors of the ballroom slammed shut behind her, cutting off her screams abruptly, leaving the suffocating finality of her arrest hanging in the stagnant air. Near the center of the room, amidst the crushed white orchids and the dark, spreading stain of spilled Cabernet, Vanessa knelt on the cold marble. The intricate layers of her custom Vera Wang wedding gown were ruined, soaked in wine, and embedded with shattered crystal. The pristine golden child looked like a discarded broken doll. She clung desperately to the tailored trouser leg of Marcus Coleman. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the fine wool fabric, sobbing uncontrollably. "Marcus, please do not leave me." Vanessa choked out her voice, muffled against his knee. "We can fix this. We can hire lawyers. We can move away. Just do not walk out that door. I love you, Marcus. Please, I love you." Marcus stood rigidly above her. The brilliant tech executive who had entered the venue believing he was joining a loving, supportive family stared down at the weeping woman clutching his leg. He processed her desperate pleas through the clinical, analytical lens of a man who had just narrowly avoided financial assassination. He recognized that her tears were not born of heartbreak over a lost relationship. They were born of stark terror over a lost asset. Marcus did not bend down to comfort her. He did not offer a reassuring hand. He reached up and slowly unpinned the white rose boutonniere from the lapel of his tuxedo. He dropped the pristine flower directly onto the stained marble floor, letting it fall into the puddle of spilled wine near Vanessa's knees. He firmly pried her desperate fingers off his leg, stepping back to break physical contact entirely. He did not utter a single word of parting. He turned his back on his weeping bride and walked purposefully toward the exit, his posture straight, reclaiming his independence and his intellectual property. The sound of his steady footsteps echoing across the empty hall was the final nail in the coffin of Vanessa's fraudulent salvation. At the catering station near the front of the stage, the two United States Marshals hauled Richard upward. The former billionaire groaned as they pulled him off the shattered crystal and soaked linen, twisting his handcuffed arms securely behind his back. The sheer physical exertion and the crushing reality of his public exposure had aged him a decade in the span of 30 minutes. His face, previously flushed with arrogant fury, was now a pale ashen gray. A thin, dark line of blood tricked down his chin from a minor cut sustained during his violent takedown onto the broken glass. His custom tuxedo jacket was torn at the shoulder, stained with water and crushed flower petals. The marshals turned him toward the exit, forcing him to walk parallel to the edge of the dais. As he was marched roughly past me, Richard halted his dragging steps, forcing the federal officers to pause for a fraction of a second. He lifted his head, locking eyes with me. The aggressive, domineering patriarch was gone, replaced by a hollow, broken man. Yet even in the depths of his utter ruination, the deeply ingrained habit of attempting to assert dominance flickered one final time. "You will never see a single dime from this family." Richard hissed, his voice weak and trembling, a pathetic echo of his former courtroom baritone. "I will drag this out in bankruptcy court for years. I will make sure you get absolutely nothing. You hear me, nothing." I looked down at the ruined, handcuffed man. I reached into the pocket of my blazer with my uninjured hand and withdrew a clean folded handkerchief. I slowly and deliberately pressed the white cotton against the bleeding wound on my left palm, watching the stark contrast of the bright red blood soaking into the pristine fabric. I offered him a slow, chilling smile. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth, a terrifying display of absolute, unassailable power. Richard, said, my voice barely above a whisper yet, carrying with lethal clarity in the quiet room. You seem to misunderstand the fundamental mechanics of a hostile takeover. I gestured slowly across the empty, devastated ballroom, taking in the grand architecture, the discarded luxury items, and the massive unpaid catering bills littering the tables. This family does not possess a single dime to withhold from me, I stated, ensuring every word landed with brutal mathematical precision. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your corporate credit is suspended. Your equity is entirely vaporized. I am not waiting for a meager inheritance or a lengthy bankruptcy settlement. I leaned slightly over the edge of the stage, closing the distance between us, looking directly into his defeated, terrified eyes. I already hold the senior debt on everything you thought you owned, I concluded quietly. Every brick in this estate, every bottle of wine in the cellar, and the very ground you are standing on right now belongs exclusively to Zenith Capital. You have absolutely nothing left to give, Richard, because I have already taken it all. Richard stared at me. The final microscopic ember of defiance in his eyes extinguished completely. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The sheer, overwhelming totality of his loss finally crushed his spirit. The marshals jerked his arms forward, breaking his frozen stance, and marched the silent, broken man out of the ballroom, leaving me standing alone amidst the ruins of the empire I had just legally conquered. The harsh, fluorescent glow of the Chicago skyline reflected off the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office at Zenith Capital. It was exactly 1 week after the disastrous Greenwich wedding reception. The chaos of the ballroom, the shattered crystal, and the frantic arrests felt distant, cleanly compartmentalized into sterile legal filings and structured asset liquidation protocols. I sat behind my heavy oak desk, an untouched cup of black coffee resting near my keyboard, my eyes locked on the live feed broadcasting across my secondary monitor. The high-definition security footage provided a silent, relentless stream of the Pierce family's systematic dismantling. A highly specialized team of commercial debt recovery agents, contracted directly by Zenith Capital, was currently sweeping through the primary Pierce estate in Connecticut. The sprawling 6-bedroom colonial mansion, the central hub of Richard's meticulously manufactured illusion of generational wealth, was being gutted with ruthless mechanical efficiency. I watched the live feed shift to the grand foyer. 2 men in dark uniforms carefully maneuvered a massive antique grandfather clock out the front door, loading it into the back of a waiting moving truck. The heavy mahogany piece had stood in that hallway for 2 decades, serving as a prominent symbol of the family's supposed permanence. Now it was simply lot number 402, tagged with a barcode destined for a public auction to partially satisfy a fraction of Richard's massive unpaid liabilities. I felt no twinge of nostalgia watching the house empty out. I felt no surge of misplaced pity for the family being forcefully evicted from their opulent stronghold. The only emotion registering in my chest was the cold, sterile satisfaction of balancing a heavily corrupted ledger. The camera feed cycled to the second floor, settling on the master suite previously occupied by Vanessa. This was the specific room where the golden child had hoarded the spoils of her fraudulent lifestyle. 4 agents wearing sterile white gloves were actively clearing out her extensive custom-built walk-in closet. They did not handle the items with reverence. They systematically shoved dozens of pristine designer handbags, rows of unworn luxury footwear, and racks of high-end evening gowns into heavy reinforced cardboard moving boxes. Every single item in that room, the Birkin bags, the Jimmy Choo heels, the entire meticulously curated wardrobe, had been purchased using the fraudulent corporate credit card Richard had illegally established under my stolen Social Security number. The agents sealed the heavy cardboard boxes with thick strips of red tamper-evident tape, marking them distinctly as seized evidence relevant to an active federal fraud investigation. Vanessa's entire carefully constructed identity, purchased exclusively with stolen funds, was being packed away and sealed by court order. My desk phone chimed a sharp professional tone cutting through the quiet office. I diverted my attention from the monitor, recognizing the secure direct line assigned exclusively to high-level legal counsel. I tapped the speaker button, keeping my eyes on the live feed. Audrey, the deep, resonant voice of Judge Harrison Thorne, filled the office. He was calling from his private chambers in the state appellate court. "Good morning, Harrison," I replied, my tone maintaining the respectful professional cadence required when addressing a sitting judge. "I trust the commercial docket is proceeding smoothly. It is proceeding with remarkable efficiency." Judge Thorne confirmed, a hint of dry judicial satisfaction coloring his words. "I am calling to inform you that the bankruptcy court formally approved Richard Pierce's Chapter 11 liquidation filing at 9 o'clock this morning. The receiver has full authorization to begin dispensing the remaining physical assets to the senior creditors." I watched the screen as the recovery agents hauled a heavy velvet chaise lounge out of Vanessa's room. "Excellent," I said. "Zenith Capital will coordinate directly with the court-appointed receiver to streamline the auction process. There is a secondary matter regarding the criminal referrals." Judge Thorne continued, his tone shifting into a more serious investigative register. "The federal prosecutor reviewing the incident at the estate has finalized the initial charging documents. Richard is currently facing a minimum of 7 years in a federal penitentiary for massive corporate wire fraud and systemic tax evasion. The evidence you provided regarding the cross-collateralization scheme with Marcus Coleman's startup solidified the grand jury indictment." A small, genuine smile touched my lips. Richard, the man who had spent his entire life bullying subordinates and hiding behind his wealth, was about to discover exactly how little leverage he possessed within the rigid confines of the federal prison system. "And Evelyn," I asked, leaning back in my leather chair. "The United States Attorney's Office is aggressively pursuing the identity theft and extortion charges against your mother," the judge answered. "They have formally indicted Evelyn for severe medical identity fraud and the illegal procurement of controlled narcotics across state lines. Given the clear audio recording you provided of her attempting to utilize those forged medical records for extortion, the prosecutors are not offering a favorable plea agreement. She is facing significant mandatory prison time. You executed a flawless operation." Audrey, Judge Thorne concluded, his voice conveying a rare note of genuine professional respect. "You dismantled a highly toxic, deeply entrenched fraudulent enterprise using precise legal instruments. You did very well." "Thank you, Harrison," I replied. "The system functions correctly when presented with irrefutable data. I appreciate your swift action regarding the commercial injunction." I terminated the call. I turned my full attention back to the security feed. The exterior camera angle showed the front driveway of the Pierce estate. A heavy-duty flatbed tow truck was currently backing slowly toward the closed garage doors. The bright yellow brand-new Porsche 911, the extravagant vehicle Richard had purchased for Vanessa, using the funds illegally drained from my grandfather's educational trust, sat gleaming in the morning sun. A recovery agent secured heavy industrial steel chains around the axles of the sports car. The hydraulic winch engaged with a loud mechanical whine, slowly dragging the luxury vehicle onto the flatbed in broad daylight. The neighbors in the exclusive Greenwich community, the people Richard and Evelyn had spent decades trying to impress, were undoubtedly watching from behind their silk curtains. The public, undeniable spectacle of the repossession was the final devastating blow to the Pierce family's social standing. The illusion was completely shattered. I minimized the security feed window, returning to my primary workstation. The liquidation of the Pierce assets was a necessary administrative task, but it was not the ultimate goal. The punitive phase of this operation was officially concluded. It was time to initiate the constructive phase. I opened a secure legal file on my desktop, navigating to a drafted municipal zoning application. The document detailed the proposed transfer of ownership and the structural repurposing of the sprawling Greenwich estate, the very property I had foreclosed upon during the wedding reception. I did not intend to sell the property to another wealthy family. I did not intend to level the grounds and develop luxury condominiums. I intended to permanently alter the legacy of that specific location. I reviewed the final clauses of the application. The sprawling mansion, with its grand ballroom and extensive library, was slated for a massive, comprehensive renovation. The estate formerly known as the center of Richard Pierce's arrogant, deceptive empire was being officially rezoned and legally restructured into the Zenith Foundation Women's Center. The facility would operate as a fully funded nonprofit training institute specifically dedicated to providing advanced financial literacy education, comprehensive legal support, and intensive career development resources for women who had survived severe financial abuse and systemic domestic exploitation. I typed my digital signature onto the final authorization line, officially executing the transfer of the deed to the nonprofit subsidiary. I sat back staring at the completed document. The Pierce family had spent 30 years utilizing their wealth to crush independence, manipulate vulnerable individuals, and enforce a cruel, self-serving hierarchy. They had kicked my chair out from under me, expecting me to remain on the floor. I had utilized the cold, precise machinery of distressed asset management to seize their entire kingdom. Now I was taking the ruins of their fraudulent, toxic empire and actively transforming it into a fortress designed specifically to empower and protect individuals, exactly like the young, vulnerable woman I used to be. The ledger was not just balanced, it was completely rewritten. Exactly 1 month after the devastating foreclosure at the Greenwich estate, the secure encrypted phone line sitting on the far edge of my mahogany desk began to ring. It was a secondary number, heavily restricted, and known only to my immediate executive team, high-level legal counsel, and the federal receivers currently managing the complex liquidation of Richard's bankrupt empire. I paused the quarterly financial review I was drafting. I picked up the sleek black handset, expecting a routine update from the bankruptcy court regarding the ongoing auction of the seized Pierce assets. Audrey, a voice stammered through the encrypted connection. The single word was weak, breathless, and laced with profound, unmistakable desperation. The polished, arrogant cadence of the Pierce family's golden child had entirely evaporated, replaced by the frantic, exhausted tone of a woman actively drowning in reality. It was Vanessa. I did not immediately respond. I leaned back in my leather executive chair, maintaining absolute silence, allowing the stark contrast between her current reality and her former arrogance to settle heavily into the connection. The background noise filtering through her end of the line was chaotic and harsh. I heard the distinct clattering sounds of cheap ceramic plates, the aggressive sizzle of a greasy commercial deep fryer, and the loud, abrasive shouting of a chaotic kitchen environment. Vanessa was not calling from the quiet luxury of a high-end spa or a secluded country club lounge. She was calling from the middle of a frantic shift at a low-end, high-volume diner on the outskirts of the city. The woman who had proudly worn a custom Vera Wang gown while hurling insults at me was now wearing a stained polyester uniform, completely dependent on the meager tips of late-night truckers and exhausted commuters. "Audrey, please do not hang up." Vanessa pleaded, her voice cracking under the intense strain of her new, brutal existence. The desperation in her tone was visceral. "I know you hate us. I know you took everything. But I am begging you. I have nowhere else to turn." I kept my voice smooth, cold, and entirely devoid of any sisterly empathy. "How did you acquire this restricted number, Vanessa?" I asked, addressing the logistical breach rather than acknowledging her pathetic plea. "I paid one of the paralegals working at the bankruptcy firm," she confessed, her words rushing out in a frantic, panicked stream. "I gave him the last $200 I had left from selling my engagement ring setting just to get a direct line to you. Please, you have to listen to me." I listened. I allowed her to articulate the full extent of the Pierce family's rapid, comprehensive destruction. "Dad suffered a minor stroke 3 days ago while sitting in the federal holding facility." Vanessa cried, her voice hitching with raw, unfiltered terror. "The prison hospital is treating him, but the prosecutors are refusing to delay his upcoming wire fraud trial. He is terrified, Audrey. He is completely terrified." I did not offer a word of comfort. The man who had ruthlessly pushed me into a glass cabinet and stolen my educational future was finally experiencing the cold, indifferent machinery of a system he could not manipulate with a checkbook. And Mom Vanessa continued, her sobs becoming more pronounced. The federal court froze all of her remaining joint accounts pending the identity theft investigation. She does not even possess enough liquid cash to retain a basic public defender for her narcotics distribution hearing next week. She is facing a mandatory minimum sentence, and she is entirely alone. The devastating inventory of their collapse continued, finally arriving at the core of Vanessa's desperate outreach. Marcus served me with absolute finalized annulment papers. The very morning after the wedding, Vanessa sobbed the reality of her lost salvation hitting her anew. He blocked my number. He locked down all of his company assets. I have absolutely nothing left, Audrey. I am working double shifts waiting tables at this greasy diner, and I am still 3 weeks behind on rent for a tiny, miserable studio apartment. The landlord is threatening to evict me by Friday. She paused, taking a ragged, desperate breath, preparing to launch the final pathetic manipulation tactic the Pierce family had left in their arsenal. Please, Audrey, Vanessa begged, utilizing the heavy, emotional leverage of blood ties she had previously ignored. I am your sister. We are family. I know we made mistakes, but you cannot just let us die on the street. Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Just wire me $5,000. Just enough to keep a roof over my head and get Mom a decent lawyer. You are a billionaire now. $5,000 is nothing to you. Please have some mercy. We are blood. The silence stretching across the encrypted line was absolute. I held the phone steadily, analyzing her desperate plea. This was the ultimate final conflict. It was not a battle over legal documents, corporate debt, or federal indictments. It was a psychological war, a desperate attempt to manipulate my empathy, to use the toxic illusion of familial loyalty to extract resources she had entirely failed to earn. She was attempting to pull me back into the parasitic dynamic I had just spent months meticulously destroying. I picked up a heavy silver Mont Blanc pen from my desk organizer. I began tapping the blunt end of the expensive writing instrument against the solid oak surface of my desk in a slow, deliberate, rhythmic pattern. The sharp metallic clicks echoed softly through the phone line, a cold, mechanical metronome marking the final seconds of her delusion. Vanessa, I said, my voice carrying the precise, unyielding edge of a surgeon holding a scalpel. Do you recall the exact words you shouted at me in the grand ballroom of the Greenwich estate, just before Richard attempted to force Marcus into signing that fraudulent cross-collateralization agreement? Vanessa fell silent, her desperate sobbing halting abruptly. You threw a dirty, grease-stained napkin directly at my face. I reminded her, ensuring the memory of her arrogance was sharply defined against the backdrop of her current humiliation. You stood there in your stolen designer gown, purchased with a credit card you illegally opened, using my stolen Social Security number, and you ordered me to wipe the floor. You told me I was nothing more than a pathetic, worthless cleaning girl hired to handle the garbage. The loud clattering of plates and the shouting from the diner kitchen continued in the background, a stark soundtrack to her total defeat. You were absolutely correct, Vanessa. I stated, my tone devoid of any malice, delivering the final verdict with clinical detachment. I am a cleaner. I specialize in identifying toxic, useless liabilities and removing them permanently from the operational environment. I stopped tapping the pen. The silence was deafening. I have thoroughly cleaned the garbage out of my life, I concluded. I did not wait for a response. I did not wait for another hysterical apology or another desperate plea for unearned financial salvation. I pressed the red button on the console, severing the connection instantly. I immediately opened the security interface on my desktop terminal. I accessed the restricted communication logs for my private line. I located the inbound connection, originating from the burner phone Vanessa had utilized. With 3 quick, decisive keystrokes, I flagged the number, authorized a permanent block at the network level, and instructed the system to automatically reject any future routing attempts from that specific exchange. I closed the security window and turned my attention back to the quarterly financial review waiting on my screen. There would be no toxic forgiveness. There would be no secret wire transfers to ease their suffering. The Pierce family had spent 30 years violently extracting resources from me to sustain their fraudulent illusion of superiority. I had severed the supply line. The ultimate, most devastating punishment for Vanessa was not a dramatic confrontation or a vindictive lawsuit. The most agonizing consequence was the simple, unavoidable reality she now faced. The golden child, entirely devoid of practical skills, professional work ethic, or independent financial resources, was now forced to survive in a harsh, unforgiving world without a host to parasitize. I had not destroyed her. I had simply stopped protecting her from herself. The mid-morning sun caught the sleek, geometric angles of the skyscrapers towering over Chicago's financial district. I sat at a quiet corner table inside an upscale minimalist cafe, favored by high-level executives and venture capitalists seeking discretion. The low hum of espresso machines and the muted rapid-fire conversations regarding market fluctuations created a steady professional backdrop. I checked the slim silver watch on my wrist. It was exactly 10 o'clock. The heavy glass door of the cafe swung open. Marcus Coleman walked in, scanning the room with sharp, intelligent eyes before spotting me in the corner. The man approaching my table bore little resemblance to the bewildered, devastated groom who had stood frozen amidst the wreckage of the Greenwich estate just 5 weeks earlier. The expensive tailored tuxedo had been replaced by a sharp, modern charcoal suit devoid of a tie. The posture of a man desperately seeking acceptance from a hostile, manipulative family had vanished entirely. In its place stood the formidable, self-assured presence of a chief executive officer who had just successfully navigated a major corporate crisis and protected his intellectual property from a hostile, fraudulent takeover. Marcus pulled out the chair opposite mine and sat down. He did not offer a tentative, socially awkward greeting. He reached across the small, round marble table and extended his right hand, looking me directly in the eye. "I owe you a corporate life," Marcus stated. His voice was firm, carrying a deep, resonant sincerity that cut straight through the typical guarded pleasantries of the financial sector. I met his gaze and accepted the handshake. His grip was strong and decisive. "You do not owe me anything, Marcus," I replied, my tone maintaining a level, professional distance. I executed a standard distressed asset liquidation. Exposing Richard Pierce's cross-collateralization scheme was merely a necessary operational step in securing Zenith Capital's primary position as the senior creditor. Marcus let out a short, dry laugh, releasing my hand and leaning back in his chair. He shook his head, a complex mixture of profound relief and lingering disbelief crossing his features. "You can frame it in clinical financial terms all you want," Audrey, Marcus said. "But the reality is much starker. You did not just save my software startup from a massive predatory asset seizure. You saved my entire life from a carefully orchestrated toxic nightmare." I walked into that estate believing I was joining a supportive, established family. I was completely blind to the fact that Richard and Vanessa viewed me entirely as a disposable financial asset, a convenient mechanism to quietly absorb their hidden crippling debts. He paused, a dark shadow passing over his eyes as he recalled the manipulative tactics employed in the library. Richard utilized every insidious, unspoken bias in that room. Marcus continued, his voice hardening with the cold clarity of a man who had finally seen the entire board. He weaponized class structure and racial dynamics. He knew I was a self-made outsider striving for legitimacy within that old money establishment. He exploited my desire for acceptance to pressure me into signing away 5 years of grueling, relentless coding. He expected me to be intimidated by the venue, the elite guests, and the implied threat of social exclusion. He nearly succeeded. I opened the slim leather portfolio resting on the table in front of me. I withdrew a thick, bound document, the pages crisp and pristine. It was the finalized, heavily vetted Series A funding contract. "Richard relied on manipulation and leverage," I said, sliding the document across the smooth marble surface toward him. "He operated on the assumption that you would prioritize the illusion of belonging over the hard data of a balance sheet. Zenith Capital operates differently. We do not require emotional leverage. We require transparency, rigorous audits, and a mutually beneficial financial structure." Marcus looked down at the contract. This was not a deceptive, hastily drafted agreement shoved into his hands in a dimly lit library. This was a comprehensive, meticulously detailed term sheet vetted by his own independent legal team, outlining a clean $5 million capital injection into Apex Security Solutions. The terms were demanding, but fair, prioritizing aggressive growth and protecting his proprietary algorithms. The toxic, parasitic dynamic that Richard had attempted to force upon Marcus had been entirely obliterated, replaced by a straightforward professional alliance built on solid financial metrics and mutual respect. Marcus retrieved a heavy black fountain pen from the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He did not hesitate. He did not ask for a final desperate reassurance. He flipped directly to the signature page at the back of the document and signed his name with sharp, decisive strokes, officially securing the funding that would propel his company to the next level. He closed the portfolio and slid it back across the table. "I understand you severed all contact with them." Marcus noted his tone shifting from business to a quiet, respectful observation. "Permanently," I confirmed, securing the signed contract back inside my portfolio. "Richard is awaiting trial. Evelyn is negotiating a plea deal for the federal fraud charges. Vanessa is facing the reality of a life without stolen credit. I have removed them from my operational sphere entirely." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the profound necessity of that boundary. "It is a strange realization," he said quietly, looking out the cafe window at the bustling street. "Realizing that the people who share your blood, or the people who claim to welcome you into their family, can be the most dangerous adversaries you will ever face." I took a sip of my coffee, the bitter dark roast grounding me in the present moment. I had spent 3 decades internalizing the lie that familial loyalty demanded silent submission to abuse. I had spent my entire life believing that my worth was dictated by the very people who actively sought to destroy it. "I will never reclaim the biological family I was born into," I stated, my voice calm, steady, and devoid of any lingering grief. They manufactured a reality where I was an unstable, worthless burden, a narrative designed specifically to isolate me and justify their exploitation. I spent years surviving in the shadows they created. I looked across the table at Marcus, a brilliant engineer who had nearly lost everything to the same toxic illusion, now sitting as a fully funded independent CEO. "But I have discovered something far more valuable," I continued. "I have built a formidable alliance of individuals who prioritize absolute truth, relentless competence, and unwavering professional integrity over the hollow manipulative demands of bloodlines." The transaction was complete. The contract was signed. The traumatic, chaotic chapter involving the Pierce family was officially closed. Family is not determined by a shared last name or an obligatory presence at a holiday table, I concluded, gathering my portfolio and preparing to leave. Family is constructed. It is a structure built meticulously on a foundation of fierce loyalty, radical transparency, and the mutual recognition of actual demonstrated capability. Everything else is simply a liability waiting to be liquidated. I stood up from the table. Marcus stood with me, extending his hand one final time. It was a handshake between 2 survivors who had successfully navigated a minefield of deception and emerged stronger, sharper, and entirely free. The night air high above the Chicago skyline carries a distinct, sharp bite, a chilling reminder of the winter settling over the city. I stand alone on the expansive terrace of my penthouse, gripping the smooth, cold steel of the balcony railing. I look down at the geometric grid of city lights stretching out toward the dark horizon, a sprawling network of ambition, commerce, and relentless forward momentum. The deep, rhythmic pulse of the financial district beats steadily far below my feet. Up here, suspended above the noise and the chaos of the streets, the silence is profound and heavy. It is not the hollow, oppressive silence of isolation that I endured during my childhood. It is a quiet, powerful sanctuary that I purchased, a fortress constructed entirely on my own uncompromising terms. The wind catches the heavy wool edge of my coat, but I do not shiver. I watch the distant, tiny headlights moving along the concrete arteries of the city, feeling a deep, grounding sense of permanent closure. The chaotic, toxic chapter of my life involving the Pierce dynasty is effectively and legally erased. The ledger holds no more outstanding debts. The liquidation of their fraudulent empire concluded with clinical, undeniable precision. The consequences they now face are not born of malice, but of the strict, unyielding application of the law. Richard Pierce is currently serving his federal sentence in a medium-security correctional facility in upstate New York. The man who once demanded absolute obedience from the head of a mahogany dining table, who ordered security guards to assault his own daughter, now dictates his daily schedule according to the harsh, unforgiving bells of a federal cell block. His bespoke, tailored tuxedos are gone, replaced by stiff, standard-issue uniform fabric. He no longer commands boardrooms or intimidates vulnerable software engineers. He spends his days assigned to menial labor tasks, taking orders from correctional officers who do not care about his former country club memberships or his vanished wealth. His voice, once a booming instrument of control and manipulation, now echoes uselessly against concrete walls. Evelyn resides in a sterile county holding center, awaiting the start of her criminal trial for federal medical identity theft and narcotics distribution. The pristine, untouchable matriarch, who wielded her social standing like a blunt weapon to bludgeon anyone she deemed inferior, now spends her days negotiating for basic commissary privileges. The elite friends she spent decades desperately trying to impress the wealthy women she hosted at lavish charity galas, funded by stolen credit, abandoned her. The precise moment the federal handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, her meticulously crafted reputation is reduced to a sensationalized headline in the local crime blotters. She faces the stark, terrifying reality of a mandatory minimum sentence stripped of the designer clothes, the expensive jewelry, and the fraudulent superiority she used to justify her cruelty. And Vanessa, my older sister, the pristine golden child who built her entire arrogant identity on the foundation of my stolen credit score, now navigates a starkly different, unforgiving reality. She inhabits a cramped, poorly insulated studio apartment on the industrial outskirts of a neighboring city, far away from the manicured lawns of Greenwich. She works grueling double graveyard shifts at a highway diner, wiping down sticky-stained laminate tables and serving burnt coffee to exhausted truck drivers and transient commuters. Her hands, once adorned with a stolen 3-carat diamond ring, are now raw and blistered from industrial dish soap. She wears a stained polyester uniform instead of custom Vera Wang silk. Her phone never rings with exclusive invitations to charity galas or yacht club mixers. She exists in the exact state of crushing invisibility and grinding poverty she and her parents once forced upon me. She walks down the street and nobody looks twice. She is learning the grueling physical mechanics of survival in a world that does not care about her manufactured sense of entitlement. I do not feel any lingering pity when I review the routine reports from the private investigator assigned to monitor her compliance with the bankruptcy court orders. I feel a deep, stabilizing sense of equilibrium. If you are listening to this account, you might recognize the specific, suffocating weight of being the designated target in your own home. You might know exactly what it feels like to be utilized as a convenient prop, a human punching bag, or a dumping ground for the deep-seated insecurities of the people who were supposed to protect and nurture you. You know the crushing, mind-altering injustice of watching a toxic family member fabricate a flawless, loving public image while systematically dismantling your sanity and stealing your resources in private. You understand the agony of being labeled the unstable, ungrateful disappointment while the true parasites drain your future to fund their illusions. The natural human instinct in those agonizing moments is to fight back loudly. You want to scream the truth at the top of your lungs. You want to cry, to argue, to present logical facts, and to beg the bystanders to see the abuse hidden in plain sight. You hope that if you just shout loud enough, if you just explain your pain clearly enough, the abusers will finally realize the depth of their cruelty, drop their weapons, and offer a genuine healing apology. Do not waste your breath. Do not scream. Do not cry. Do not engage in futile, exhausting arguments with individuals who are fundamentally committed to misunderstanding you. Arguing with a manipulator only provides them with the emotional reaction they crave to sustain their narrative. It gives them the necessary ammunition to label you as unstable, irrational, or overly emotional to outsiders. When you fight back with raw emotion, you play directly into the trap they designed. Instead, you must close your mouth and open your eyes. Embrace the silence. Silence is not a symptom of surrender. It is a highly effective tactical retreat. Let the toxic individuals believe they have broken your spirit. Let them believe you are weak, defeated, and entirely inconsequential. Let them grow arrogant, sloppy, and comfortable in their delusion of total control. Take the cruel invisibility they force upon you and forge it into a lethal, undeniable weapon. While they are busy parading their hollow victories, spending stolen resources, and tearing you down to their peers, you must retreat into the shadows and work. Gather your evidence meticulously piece by agonizing piece. Document every lie, every fraudulent financial transaction, and every abuse of power. Save the emails. Archive the bank statements. Record the threats. Build an airtight, unassailable case while they sleep comfortably in their arrogance. Educate yourself relentlessly. Secure your own independent resources, no matter how small they seem at first. Construct your empire quietly, brick by brick, far away from their destructive reach and their watchful eyes. Become a ghost in their fabricated narrative, all while positioning yourself as the unseen architect of their inevitable downfall. The most dangerous adversary is the one who operates without making a single sound. When the inevitable day arrives and they decide to humiliate you one final time to inflate their own fragile egos, you will be ready. When they kick the chair out from under you in front of a crowded room, expecting you to shatter into a million pieces, do not collapse onto the floor in tears. Do not offer them the satisfaction of a public breakdown. Stand up slowly. Brush the dust off your coat. Reveal the steel trap they willingly, arrogantly walked into. Do not just defend yourself against their eviction notice or their cruel insults. Buy the entire building. Hold the legal deed in your hand, look them directly in the eye without a trace of fear, and force them out the front door. Strip them of the very assets they use to oppress you. Many people in society will call this specific behavior vindictive. They will label it as a ruthless, unhealthy quest for revenge, urging you to forgive and forget for the sake of biological ties. They are wrong. Revenge is driven by uncontrolled emotion, chaotic anger, and a desire to inflict blind pain. What I executed, and what you must aim to achieve, is the clinical, precise restoration of justice. It is the swift, undeniable correction of a deeply corrupted system. You do not owe your abusers toxic forgiveness. You do not owe them a second chance to drain your life. You do not owe them a seat at the table you built with your own scarred, bleeding hands. The only thing you owe a parasite is a finalized, non-negotiable bill for the resources they consumed. The debt is settled. The past is fully liquidated. The empire you build in the dark belongs to you. Your life is your own property. Master it. The pale, jagged scar running down my left wrist rarely aches anymore. I trace the raised tissue sometimes while reviewing complex term sheets, using it as a quiet, physical reminder of the exact price I paid for my current freedom. The Pierce dynasty is a permanently closed file sitting in the archives of a bankruptcy court. The Greenwich estate currently operates as a fully funded sanctuary for women escaping financial abuse, functioning precisely as I designed it. The grueling transition from a discarded scapegoat to the architect of my own life required stripping away everything I was taught to believe about love, loyalty, and survival. I learned 3 vital truths along the way. The first truth is that biology is a genetic coincidence, not a binding legal contract. A shared last name does not grant anyone the right to siphon your future, ruin your reputation, or demand your subservience. Real family requires consistent respect, radical transparency, and mutual protection. If the individuals raising you function as predators, you possess zero obligation to remain their designated prey. You are allowed to draft a new lineage, one built on unwavering trust rather than toxic one-sided obligation. The second lesson lies in the cold architecture of confrontation. You must never bring raw emotion to a battlefield against individuals who lack basic empathy. Tears, screams, and desperate pleas are simply currencies they consume to feed their own fragile egos. When you are under relentless attack, your greatest weapon is disciplined, impenetrable silence. Gather your data, secure your independent assets, build your leverage in the shadows. When the moment arrives to sever the connection, drop a meticulously verified paper trail, not a single tear. Hard facts do not yield to gaslighting, and recorded evidence cannot be manipulated by a charismatic smile. The final realization is understanding the true nature of victory. Genuine power is not derived from watching your abusers suffer in a greasy diner or a federal holding cell. Their current misery is merely a mathematical consequence of their own fraud. True power is waking up in a reality where their opinions, their desperate schemes, and their very existence no longer elevate your pulse. You achieve total victory the exact moment they become entirely irrelevant to your upward trajectory. I did not just survive Richard, Evelyn, and Vanessa. I rendered them obsolete. You hold the pen to your own ledger. If you are sitting in a room right now where you are treated as a disposable asset, start planning your quiet exit today. The hard floor you fall on tonight can become the foundation you purchase tomorrow. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you found clarity in this narrative, if you are ready to stop shrinking and start building your own undeniable empire, subscribe to Olivia Stories Revenge. Drop your own experiences in the comments below and join a community that understands the cold, necessary art of taking your life back. See you in the next video.